Hello, today is August 16th, 2019, and I'm here interviewing Mark Foreman about his experiences in Vietnam.
Okay, well, I want to start by explaining where I came from. When I was growing up, I grew up in Ames, Iowa, where Iowa State University is. Iowa State University was one of the many universities that were protesting the Vietnam War back in the mid to late 60s and then into the 70s. They were joining with a lot of other universities in this country protesting the war. So when I was in high school, I was hearing a lot about the draft. I couldn't understand how the government could force young people when they graduate from high school into the military, but it was obvious that that's what they were doing. And I was not a military type personality. I was very physically fit, but I had no desire to be part of any war. So when I graduated from high school in 1966, and
can you just tell us about your family? How many siblings you had?
my dad was a plumber. My mother was a stay-at-home housewife and homemaker. I have a twin sister, an older sister, and an older brother. I was the baby of the family by about 12 minutes. So growing up in Ames, it was a university town, and so it was pretty academic and intellectually oriented. So I was growing up in an atmosphere where people were thinking about what's going on in the world, which was really nice. I really appreciated my parents moving to Ames just for that reason. They wanted us to be around education. And so when I was still in high school, I was hearing about these rallies, these anti-war rallies going on over at the university. And I started going to the rallies when I was a senior in high school. I'll never forget one time the student body president invited a general to come and debate with him, the student body president, have a debate as to whether or not it was wise of the United States to be going to war with Vietnam. And I couldn't believe how little the general knew about the history of Vietnam. The student body president knew a lot about the history of Vietnam, and of course was against our involvement in the war. So myself and my peers, we would go to these lectures and debates, and we were developing a pretty strong feeling about anti-war. It was about a week after I graduated from high school that there was an article in our local newspaper that one of my classmates, he was actually a year older than me, was shot and killed in Vietnam. And so it really hit home. It just wasn't something you saw on TV anymore. It was somebody that we knew. And I felt so bad for their family. And it just deepened my resolve to be against the war. However, I was hearing a lot about the draft. And when I graduated from high school, I went to work for the railroad right after high school with the understanding that I was going to get a letter in the mail saying that I am being drafted. And I decided, that I did not want to be drafted into the Army or the Marines because they're the ones that do most of the fighting. And I'm not a fighter. I'll do everything I can to avoid any kind of fight. I knew I was that kind of person. But I knew I was going to get drafted because I was not college material at that time. My parents wouldn't have been able to afford it anyway. And so I worked on the railroad after graduating high school for about 4 months. And then, it started getting cold outside. And I started realizing that working outdoors in the winter was not going to be much fun. And I was living in an apartment, but I moved back home. And both of my parents they believed in God and country. And that whatever the U.S. government decided to do was what God wanted us to do. So they were pro the war in Vietnam. And when I moved back home, to live with my parents, my mother made it very clear that she did not want me to stay, that I needed to get out and get a job or something. So shortly after I moved back with my parents, I decided I would join the Navy to avoid being in the Army or Marines. And I went down to the recruiting office and signed up. And 2 days later, I was on a plane headed for San Diego Naval Training Center. I went to boot camp, 3 months of boot camp, which I really kind of enjoyed because of the social interaction, meeting people that lived all over the country, with different accents and very different personalities. It was fascinating to me. But about a week before we were to graduate from boot camp, my commanding officer came to me and asked what I wanted to do. This was after they'd given everybody a whole big battery of tests to find out what our aptitudes were and our interests. And to go back a little bit, about maybe a month and a half into boot camp, I developed double pneumonia and had to go to the infirmary for a week. I had a real high fever, and there were corpsmen. They're like medics. Same thing as a medic. A medic is Army and a corpsman is Navy. And I told my commanding officer I'd like to be a corpsman because what I saw when I was in the infirmary and how they took care of me, I was really impressed. And it was an occupation where you're taking care of people and you're helping people get better. And I felt real good about maybe being able to do that. So I told my commanding officer I'd like to be a corpsman. However, I didn't know that the Marines were part of the Navy and that the Marines get all of their medical personnel from the Navy. They sent me to Corps School. It's called Corps School, where we got our medical training. And it wasn't until a week before we were to graduate from Corps School that the commanding officer called all 200 of us that were being trained as corpsmen to come into a large auditorium where he announced to all of us that we were going to be going to Vietnam with the Grunt Marines. And it was quite an eye-opener, to say the least. I was thinking about going AWOL, absent without leave, is what AWOL stands for. I was thinking about going to Canada, But I knew if I did that, my parents would disown me, and plus it would take a lot of guts to do something like that, and I didn't have that. I wasn't that brave. So I decided I would stay in the Navy. I would go to Vietnam, and I got training. They called it Field Medical Training School. 3 weeks of assimilated battlefield conditions. And they did their best to try to prepare us for what we were going to be experiencing as corpsmen in Vietnam. But there's absolutely no way you can prepare any human being for something as insane as war. And however, because I knew I was going to be going over there, I was trained to mainly stop bleeding and keep them breathing until a medevac chopper could come and take them out of the field to a hospital. So after Field Medical Training School, I was psyched up to feel pretty proud of the fact that I was going to be given the opportunity to actually save lives. Now, I also knew, on the other hand, that I could get killed in the process. So when I went to Vietnam, the day that I got there, I flew into Da Nang. There was a squad leader that met me outside of the plane, and he told me, well, he had the squad with him. There were about 10 guys, 10 Marines. And he said, we're going to go to the barracks and I'll issue your M16 when we get to the barracks. And I told him just right away, I said, there's absolutely no way I'm carrying a gun over here. I'm not here to kill anyone. I'm here to stop their bleeding, keep them breathing. And that's all I'm going to do. And amazingly, he didn't argue with me. So we marched across the huge tarmac. In fact, at that time, and this was in early 1968 that I got to Vietnam. Actually, it was March 30th. And as we were marching across this huge tarmac, and this airport was the busiest airport in the world at the time. So it was just unbelievably noisy with jets landing and taking off, and helicopters and all kinds of gunships flying over us. And I remember that as far as the eye could see, as we were marching across the tarmac, everything was coated in this yellow-green from petroleum. It was just a yellow-green environment. Everything was caked with that patina. We got to the barracks, and right away we were told that we would get 2 days of orientation to Vietnam, to being in Vietnam. And for the next 2 days, our squad leader took us around the outskirts of Da Nang, showing us buildings that the North Vietnamese had recently blown up, and how many Marines were killed in every building. And he was emphasizing the fact that a mortar or a rocket could come in at any time and we would be dead. That life over here is just so temporary. And here I was 20 years old when I went to Vietnam. And that whole psychological challenge of knowing that I could be dead any minute. However, they emphasized to us how important it was not to think about it, because the more you think about it, the less focused you are on your job, which made sense. And so within like 2 days after arriving there, I was pretty much accepting the fact that I could be dead any moment, and my life would be over, and game over. And so after 2 days of orientation, then we were issued C rations, which are cans of food, to last us, I think it was a week, out in the field, out in the bush. And so for the next 5 days, that's where we were, out in the bush. Every day we would, now me being the corpsman, I'm not carrying a gun, but I'm loaded with battle dressings and morphine and IV bottles and things that we need to keep wounded Marines alive. So we would spend all day humping through all different kinds of terrain. Some days we'd go up into the jungles of the mountains. Other days we would go through villages, and it became clear, and every day we would get shot at by snipers, and nobody ever got hit by snipers, but it kept us on edge. So about 2.5, 3 weeks into being in Vietnam and humping every day and getting shot at and feeling like, and even at night when we would bed down on the ground, we just put our ponchos on the ground and fall asleep because we'd been marching all day. We were tired, and in the beginning, I was really frightened that even when I was sleeping, that a Viet Cong would sneak up on me and slit my throat. So it took a while to get to sleep. So all this fear factor, it was definitely there, but at the same time, I felt like my mind was very clear on knowing what my job was. So about 2.5 weeks into being in Vietnam, our squad joined up with another squad, which made us a platoon of about a little less than 30 of us. And I got to meet another corpsman who was in the other platoon. His name was Harry Bowman. He was from Rhode Island, and he'd been in Vietnam 2 months earlier than me. So he'd been in a couple of firefights. He'd shown his squad that he had the mettle to deal with when you're in a firefight, and go and patch up the wounded as best he could. And so he had all this experience that I didn't have yet. So he kind of took me under his wing. And the first day when we joined up with their platoon, we had a sergeant that was in charge, and he took us up a mountain. We got about 1,000 feet up on this mountain, and he had us set up. He wanted us to dig foxholes, but it was ridiculous because the mountain was solid rock. And so we just laid our ponchos down, and Harry asked if I wanted to go back down the mountain and get a hot meal. And I thought, a hot meal? Wow. And he was experienced enough how to do this. So we found a road and hitchhiked down the mountain. He knew where an army camp was that served hot food, and it was maybe the best meal I've ever had in my life. And Harry and I got to know each other. We got back to where we were up on the side of the mountain at about mid-afternoon. And we were just sitting on the side of the mountain looking out over some of the most exotically beautiful landscape I'd ever seen. The Vietnamese were way down, way down in the valley in the rice paddies with their whole family, grandma and grandpa and parents and children. They were out in the rice paddy working with their water buffalo. It was really quite beautiful, and Harry and I were sitting there just getting to know each other, talking about our friends back home and our family, and all of a sudden machine gun fire breaks out down in the valley. There was a wooded area that probably covered about an acre of land that was in the middle of the rice paddies, trees, about an acre's worth of trees, and machine gun fire opened up down there. And I'd say 10 minutes later, two gunships, helicopters, each one loaded with 14 rockets and two miniguns, one on each side of the gunship. So they came over the mountains down into the valley and hovered about 300 feet above the area of trees where the firefight was happening. And one helicopter at a time, would lower at about a 45-degree angle to point right down at the trees, and it would real slowly and unbelievably loud slowly start making its way down to the trees, and it fired two rockets into the trees, and then when it got really close, the machine guns opened up on the trees. And then that pilot would come back up and the other one would go down and empty two rockets at a time. And they did that 7 times, emptying their rockets. And so when they were finished, and while this was happening, we were just up on the side of the mountain watching. We weren't getting orders to go down there to help or anything. And so about 15 minutes after the helicopters left, a jet with two 500-pound bombs came over the mountain, flew right over the trees, dropped the two 500-pound bombs inside of those trees. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, what are we doing? There are Marines down there. And so I had this real awakening that we were not only killing Vietnamese, we were killing ourselves. So it really hit me hard that the military would bomb our own Marines. But that's obviously what was happening. So my friend Harry and I continued talking and getting to know each other. This is my first day of meeting him. And he was such a wonderful guy. He had a great sense of humor. He was very intelligent. He'd gone to college for 2 years. He was majoring in biology. And I was really enjoying getting to know him and being able to talk to another corpsman, because the Marines, every other word was a cuss word, and the things that they wanted to talk about were things that just were irrelevant to me. And so socially I was pretty isolated until Harry joined our group. And so we continued talking all afternoon, and then it started getting dark. And so when it got pitch black, we lay down on our ponchos to go to sleep. Well, it wasn't more than 10 minutes later that there were these incredible bright lights and then explosions about 100 feet up from us on the mountain. And we didn't know what to think. What the heck happened? Immediately I thought we're being attacked, but then there wasn't any machine gun fire or any other fire other than the bright lights and these explosions, multiple explosions. And then I started hearing moaning up on the mountain. And so, being the corpsman, it's my job to go see what's going on. So, and it was pitch black. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face. And so I crawled up using my fingers to feel my way up, following the sound of the moans. I found one of the Marines that was wounded. He was embedded in a bush. And so I was able to pull him out of the bush and asked him, "Where does it hurt?" And he said, "All over, Doc, all over." And because I couldn't see, I decided I'd start feeling at the top of his head and working my way down. And there was a lot of glob of blood on his cheek. And so I tied a battle dressing over that. And then I tore his shirt open and found 6 sucking chest wounds. A sucking chest wound is when a hole goes into your lungs, and when you breathe, the air bubbles out of the holes. And there were 6 of these holes, and I had a special gauze dressing that would plug up the hole. And so I plugged up all 6 holes, and then started feeling down the rest of his body. And thank goodness he only had one more cut on his wrist, and it was a deep cut. And I was surprised it wasn't bleeding like crazy, but then I realized he was in deep shock. And when you go into deep shock, your blood circulation slows way, way down. It's the body's way of taking care of you when you're in that much trauma. So my platoon sergeant found me with this wounded Marine, and we decided to get him into a Jeep and take him down to the bottom of the mountain where there was a landing pad, a helicopter landing pad, that he could be medevaced out. So I took his feet, and the platoon sergeant took his hands, and we carried him over to a Jeep and put him in the back of the Jeep, and I sat in back with him while the platoon sergeant and one other Marine were up front, and they started driving down the mountain. I realized that he wasn't breathing, and I told the platoon sergeant to stop the Jeep, and I could see that he wasn't breathing, and so I started giving him mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. And when I would breathe into his mouth, blood was spraying into my face. And I found out that his eye was blown out, and that his throat was clogged with blood. So when I blew into his mouth, the air was escaping through the eye socket. And that's when I knew that his throat was clogged with blood, and I had to do a tracheotomy on him. A tracheotomy is where you make a slit just below the Adam's apple, and so I found a razor blade in my bag, and it pitch black. I was feeling my way through the whole thing, and made a real deep slit in his throat. Took apart a ballpoint pen and put the hollow part into his trachea, and by goodness, it was working. He was breathing again. And so we started heading down the mountain again. And then I was checking his pulse, and I could feel no pulse, believing that his heart had stopped. So I yelled at my platoon sergeant, "Stop the Jeep. Somebody's got to come back here and do the mouth to trach breathing, and I would do the closed cardiac massage of the heart, you know, bam, 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 bam." And this is my first patient. We get down to the bottom of the mountain. We take him out of the, at the landing pad, and take the wounded Marine out of the Jeep and lay him on the ground and continue with the closed cardiac massage. And I tried to start an IV because he'd lost a lot of blood. And okay, sometimes I am there. So I tried starting an IV and it would not work. 3 hours later, a helicopter shows up with a doctor. And the doctor checked him over and said he's been dead for at least a couple of hours. But as a corpsman, they never trained us to diagnose death. So I didn't know when to stop trying to keep him alive. So we continued with the closed cardiac, with the trach and the closed cardiac massage until the doctor got there. So now it's probably about 3 o'clock in the morning, something like that. And we get in the Jeep and drive back up. Well, of course they took the dead Marine off. And then we went back up to where we were camped. And on the way up there, my platoon sergeant explained to me what had happened. That the guy that we were working on was a platoon or a squad leader, and he had just gotten back from R&R, and he was training his squad how to set up what's called a trip flare at night, because whenever you camp for the night, you have to set up trip flares all around a perimeter around where you're camped. And if somebody tries to come through and they trip the wire, then a flare goes off. Well, the flare went off, and the platoon or the squad leader didn't want our position to be given away by this flare, so he threw his flak jacket over the flare, forgetting he had 3 grenades hooked to his flak jacket. And that's what the explosions were all about. And so it was an accident, you know. And I found out with more time of being over there that there were probably as many accidents killing us as there were Vietnamese killing us. So I needed to give a report. Okay, we're back up on the mountain. My friend Harry Bowman was now with me, and I was supposed to give a report over the radio what had happened. And I was in shock myself, somewhat of a shock, and I was having a hard time explaining what had happened. So Harry took the phone, and he very quickly explained what happened. And I learned a lot from that, you know. I was trying to go into too much detail. So, okay, then the next day the sun was coming up, and we continue humping up the mountain and then down into the valleys, and we were humping through this one valley that had a lot of grass, big long grass, and there were a lot of insects. And Harry finds this insect about 3 inches long. It's just sitting on one of the grass. And he says, come here, I want to show you this. Because he had his, he was starting to get his degree in biology. But he had a great imagination too. And so all the guys were gathered around Harry, telling us, he made up this amazing name for this bug. And he said, you've got to be very careful because they mate in hollow tunnels. And so don't let them get in your ears. I mean, it was crazy, but a little humor out there was real good. And it just endeared me more to Harry because he did have a great sense of humor. All right, so I'd been in Vietnam 4 weeks. We were still with this platoon, and we got orders then to join with 2 other platoons, which would make us a company. There were 83 of us now, and we were given orders to go to the top of this mountain. They had to fly us by helicopter to the base of the mountain that day, and we got there early. All 83 of us were at the base of the mountain, and they flew in new supplies. And so all day long, the machine gunners were loading their machine guns. Us corpsmen were loading up with lots of battle dressings and more morphine and IV bottles. They didn't tell us where we were going. They didn't tell us what we might find. And I know that they knew, now I know that they knew that there were a lot of North Vietnamese regulars up somewhere up near the top of the mountain. Military intelligence knew that they were up there. I don't know that they knew how many were up there, but they knew there were some North Vietnamese regulars up there. Well, okay, so we got resupplied and slept there at the base of the mountain that night. And then just before sunrise, we all got in single file and started humping up the mountain. And this was a big mountain. This was about a 3,000-foot mountain. And dense jungle. I was in the lead squad, and it was our job to machete the vines, just to, we were probably going about 100 feet every hour. It was really, really dense and really hot. And we got about a third of the way up the mountain, and we ran into a mountain stream, which was wonderful because it wasn't as dense as where we had been before. So we didn't have to use the machetes anymore. We just followed the stream. And really nice cold water that we could drink. So we got about 3/4 of the way up the mountain, and the stream ran out. And so we got out the machetes again and started hacking our way up. And it was very worrisome that we were making so much noise with these machetes. But we didn't know for sure what was up ahead of us. And we got just about to the top of the mountain. I mean, really huge trees. To give you an idea of the landscape, it was dense and with very, very old trees that were over 100 feet tall. Big roots. We got almost to the top of the mountain, and we hear a single shot. And we were trained well enough, when you hear a shot, hit the ground as fast as you can, which we all did. And a few minutes later, we got word up the line that the radioman in the rear platoon or squad was killed. And my immediate thought was, there's a sniper up here? You know, what the heck is a sniper doing up here? Well, a few minutes later we got orders to head up. So everybody stood up, and just as we stood up, another shot rang out, but this one was coming from in front of us. And the radioman in the squad right behind mine was shot and killed. So they've killed 2 of our 8 radiomen, and it just washed over me the understanding that they were trying to knock out our communications, and they were smart, and they were getting it done. So 2 radiomen had been killed. Our platoon sergeant was getting really antsy, really nervous, and he grabbed 2 Marines and said, "Follow me," and he took them up to the top of the mountain, and the rest of us followed them up to the top of the mountain, and he told us to wait while he and the other 2 Marines went down over the other side of the mountain. And they didn't get very far, and all hell broke loose down there. And a little while later, one of the Marines that went down there was running back up. His blood was flowing out of his ears, and he was yelling, "They got the Sarge, they got the Sarge, they blew his back out." And you know, he was in shock, and he was trying to explain to us what happened down there. So he was able to make his way up to join the rest of us, and he joined with his squad. And then the captain gave us orders to go down the other side of the mountain. And you know, we knew that there were North Vietnamese over there, but you know, I was with the Marines, and the Marines are trained not to run from fire, but to go right into it. And you know, I thought there was probably a smarter way to go about this, but this is the reality. So we all start slowly going up over the mountain, and we're walking down the other side, no machine gun fire or anything, and we run into a path, a well-worn path. And so we knew that there had to be quite a few up there. They'd been there a long time to create a path. We followed the path into what ended up being the center of a training camp, a North Vietnamese training camp. All 83 of us were able to make our way into this training camp. There was a hooch, it was a wooden shack down there in the camp, and there was a fire that they tried to put out. It was smoldering, you know, smoke, and I'll never forget this blue line of smoke making its way all the way to the top of the canopy of trees, about 130 feet up. And the canopy of trees was so thick that you couldn't see the sky. There was no direct sunlight coming through, so it felt like early evening. Okay, so we all made our way down past this shack, and then we were all clumped together. And I thought, this is insane that we're all in this like sheep in a pen. And so the captain ordered 2 of the Marines to go out and scout for about 10 minutes and then come back and report, which they did. And they found an underground chow hall, a really huge cavernous thing they dug out for their chow hall, and multiple little hospitals where there were wounded North Vietnamese on cots. And now we knew it was a really big operation. And so the captain had the 8 machine gunners. They're the guys with the really big M60 machine guns on tripods. He had them create a perimeter, and then the rest of the Marines would fill in between them to create a perimeter of fire. And it was starting to get a little bit dark now. The sun was setting, and to give you a little more information, the camp that they had created was surrounded by cliffs and other angled, anyway, there was mainly cliffs. We were in kind of a bowl. We were down in the bottom of the bowl, and the cliffs were up there. And so as it was starting to get a little bit dark, they opened up on us, and with everything they had. We found out later that there were 1,500 of them, 83 of us and 1,500 of them. And they were firing down on us, which seemed like 10 minutes to me of just continual. Try to imagine standing next to one machine gun firing, and then add another 1,500 to that. The noise was just way beyond my ability to describe. And that's all you could hear. And so it actually, in reality, it probably lasted 2 minutes. It felt more like, a lot longer than that. And when they stopped firing on us, everyone stopped all at once. That's when you could hear the screaming. And that's when Harry and I needed to go to work. It was still enough light that you could see somewhat. I crawled out. Harry and I were actually in between some big, thick roots. There was enough space to get in between them for protection. And we were waiting it out, until the firing stopped, and then we could go out and try to help wounded. And so the firing all stopped all at once. And then we heard the screams. And Harry went out one way, I went out another way. The first Marine that I got to was sitting up against a boulder. He was flailing his arms and legs like he was being swarmed by bees. And as I got closer, I saw that there was something white on over his face. And when I got up to him, I found that his skull had been completely split open and his brain was hanging over his face. And, in our training, they showed us wounded, films of wounded soldiers that looked like they ought to be dead, but they were able to put them back together. And so I got up to him. I had to wrap my legs around his torso to hold his arms down, and I put 3 big battle dressings over his head, and then let go, and right away he pulled the battle dressings off. And so then I called out for a Marine to come and help hold him down. And a Marine came over and held him down, and I put more battle dressings over. By the time I was done, it was pitch black, screaming all around me. And I went into shock. And for a long time I was ashamed to admit it, but my emotions all shut down. Not only my emotions, but my senses. I couldn't hear anything anymore. I just went blank. And it was about 6 hours later that I was gaining consciousness again. I started hearing moans. The screaming had stopped. Now it was just moaning out there in the pitch black. And I knew that if I started crawling around looking for wounded, that my own guys were going to get me, because they would think it was the NBA, North Vietnamese. And so I just crawled back in between the roots of a tree, and Harry just happened to be in those roots too. And we didn't say a word, we just fell asleep, and about an hour later the sun started coming up. And I remember I could make out kind of the outline of the trees and the boulders, and got a little bit lighter, and they opened up on us again. And the same thing for probably 2 minutes with everything they had. And it stopped, and then the screaming. And so Harry and I went out again, and now it was getting lighter. They could see any of us moving around. And so Harry went that way, I went this way, crawling towards the moans, towards the screaming. And I didn't get very far, and machine gun fire was opening up down where Harry went. And I looked back, and one of the Marines said, "They got Harry, they got Harry." And so I turn around and I make it all the way over to where Harry was. He was laying on a rock, spread eagle, on his back. And he was motionless. I felt for a pulse, and while I was feeling for the pulse, I saw the bullet hole that went straight through his heart from side to side. And it was obvious that Harry was dead. And I really, at that moment, because Harry and I had become pretty close, that I became totally without emotion. Totally. I wasn't really human anymore. I was this corpsman trained to stop bleeding and keep him breathing. Harry was about 6 feet from a Marine whose arm was blown off, and his artery was spewing all over the place. And I told him, "I'm coming. You're going to be okay. I'm coming." And but I had to get around Harry first. And so I started crawling up over Harry's head, and machine gun fire started slamming right in the ground right in front of me. I turn around and go around his feet, and then I got hit. And I went head over heels down this part of the mountain for, I don't know, maybe 100 feet or so, head over heels. And as I was flipping head over heels, I saw my foot spinning around as if my leg was rubber, soft rubber. And then I knew where I'd been hit, because I thought I'd been hit by a cement truck. You know, I just felt like I was hit all over. And but by the time I was able to grab a hold of something to stop flipping, I realized that I was hitting the leg. And there I was, laying out in the open, and I was sure, or felt pretty darn sure, of two things: that my femoral artery had been broken because of the way I was bleeding. My pants were loaded with blood, and my shirt, and I was out in the open, and so now, if they're going to shoot me again, I hope it's right in the head, and because it's the only way to get out of this, is to die. Really, I mean, I was having these feelings. That it was so insane that the only way out of this would be to die. And so I just laid there waiting to bleed to death or get shot again. And knowing that no Marine should crawl down out in the open to get me. But about 30 minutes later, 20 minutes later, I saw one of the Marines crawling down to get me, and I thought, this is suicide. However, he made it all the way down to me. He grabbed my wrist, and he laid real flat, and he just started pulling me slowly but surely all the way up and into the center of the perimeter. And then a couple of other Marines piled rocks around me, maybe about a foot high around me, to protect me from gunfire. And they left a canteen of water, and then they went back and hid in between the roots or behind the rocks or whatever. And later that morning, I was shot real early in the morning, and later that morning they tried to bring in a medevac helicopter, but because of the canopy of trees it couldn't land. And I'm seeing from my new little cocoon home, the helicopter, you couldn't see the helicopter, but the trees, the upper trees, were waving back and forth because of the helicopter blades. And a rope ladder is unfolding down through the trees. And I am thinking, now it's getting surreal and crazier every minute, every second. What wounded anybody is going to crawl 130 feet up that ladder? It didn't make any sense at all. And it just joined in the insanity. Well, of course, machine gun fire from all around went up, and that helicopter went off and crashed. Oh. And about 20 minutes later, another attempt. Same thing happened. How are we doing with Barry? And of course, the second one, the same thing happens. They blow them out of the sky. And so our captain, or the helicopter squadron leader of the squadron, radioed into our captain and said, "We're not going to try any more rescue attempts until you blow up enough trees for us to land," which took 5 days. And in those 5 days that I was laying there, I realized that my femoral artery had not been broken. I was not going to bleed to death. And and this was when I was in the cocoon of stone. I had been putting pressure with a battle dressing on the wound. It was right at my hip. And I put real hard pressure on it for about an hour. And when I took the battle dressing off, I saw that the blood was just trickling out. It wasn't spewing out anymore, it was just trickling out. And so that's when I knew my femoral artery was not broken, and I was going to, this overwhelming sense of ecstasy, absolute ecstasy of knowing that I was going to be fine. Everything was going to be fine. It was the only time in my life I've ever experienced anything like that. So after the rescue attempts to medevac us out of there, which turned out to be just as insane as everything else, then about maybe a half an hour later, a jet dropped one 500-pound bomb into this small area, and the next thing I hear is our captain on the radio swearing at the pilot for just killing 7 of our Marines. And, you know, that just proved to me that this is what's going on over here. So our captain told him no more of those. And I think what saved us, because they had us surrounded for 5 days. The battle was 6 days, you know, the night before, and then this next day. Then it took 5 days to blow up enough big trees. A helicopter still couldn't land because there was all this debris down there. But on the 5th day at about noon, they made their first attempt again to bring a helicopter down as low as possible. And it hovered about 7 feet above us. And the Marines lifted me up, and one of the Marines in the helicopter grabbed a hold of my arm and pulled me up and over. And boy, what a feeling that all was, knowing I was going to a hospital, and still this amazing sense of ecstasy that everything was going to be fine. And so they loaded up 7 of us wounded, and then Da Nang was 16 miles away, and they flew us to a field hospital just outside of Da Nang, and took me into surgery right away. I had horrible infection in my leg. My leg was at least twice as big, full of pus, as it was normally. And they got me into surgery right away. I was too weak for them to give me a general anesthetic, so they gave me a spinal to deaden everything from the waist down. And I was awake, and the surgeons asked if I wanted to watch. And being a corpsman, my first feeling was, this ought to be fascinating. But then I thought, no, I've seen enough blood, I've seen enough of this, I don't need to. And I said no, so they turned the concave mirror so I couldn't see. But I could hear them cutting away the flesh and the bone, and I woke up 3 days later in a universe of pain. And I found the nurse's call button and called her, and she came running over with the morphine. She knew that. And boy, that first shot of morphine took me onto cloud 9, and it was just absolutely wonderful. And I can't explain how ridiculous the pain was. How unbelievable. So about 3 hours later, the pain was coming back, and so they were giving me a shot of morphine every 3 hours, 24 hours a day, for 3 weeks. And in the first week, they stabilized me enough that they flew me to Japan, where there was a much bigger hospital with more surgeons, and I received 10 more major surgeries in those 3 weeks that I was in Japan. On the second week in Japan, the doctor told me that I was totally addicted to morphine and it wasn't doing any good anymore, so I had to deal with the pain. And he told me that in the morning, and by the afternoon, I was going stark raving mad, and I was in a body cast. I couldn't get out of bed to go find a pencil to stick in my heart. And believe me, I would have. So that late that afternoon, I called the nurse and told her, when she came to my bed, I told her that I am going absolutely insane. I don't know what to do. Is there somebody that can help me? And she said that she would get someone in to talk to me. Early the next morning, a young social worker came to my bedside and sat down. He was about 24 years old, and he said, "Tell me about your family." And I thought, well, that's a benign enough question. However, because I had shut down all my emotions, I had not allowed myself to think about my family when I was in Vietnam. That was real important to not. But when I started thinking about my mother, I all of a sudden just started guttural crying, and I could not stop. I couldn't stop crying. I was reconnecting with the love for my mother. And I was so embarrassed, I pulled the sheet up over my head, and I just couldn't stop crying, for about an hour. And finally, when I stopped, I was hoping he wouldn't be there, but when I pulled it down there, he's still sitting there. And he said, "What about the rest of your family?" And the same thing happened with my dad, my older brother, my sisters. I started crying again uncontrollably. And it took me years to figure out what that was all about. But it was reconnecting with love is what it was all about. And I needed to cry. And in order to get it out, So he left, and I was left with this unbelievable amount of pain. But being back in touch with the love I had for my family gave me something to shoot for, that I was going to be going home fairly soon, and that I was going to get to see my family. So I was able to live with the pain because of love. And sure enough, when they flew me all the way from Japan to Bethesda Naval Hospital in Bethesda, Maryland. And I was in an isolation ward because I had a horrible infection. And there were 3 other guys in body casts in the isolation ward there at Bethesda Naval Hospital. And I still couldn't have any morphine. Couldn't have anything. It was just me and the universe of pain. And my family, of course, came to visit, and friends came to visit. This was my new life. Pain. And so I was there at Bethesda for 5 months. And this isolation ward I was in, we were so bored out of our minds. We would get into water fights. When the corpsman would come in with the tray of stuff, we'd steal these big 50cc syringes, and they'd leave water for us and fill the syringes and squirt each other. And of course our body casts would be soaked and ruined. So they didn't yell at us, but they would take us in, and we would get new body casts every week. just to keep us sane. And then they shipped me to Des Moines, the VA hospital in Des Moines, Iowa. Horrible experiences going on there. But I wanna, if you want to take the time, I want to talk about the healing. The healing from this wasn't just physical. And I didn't know it in the beginning, but I realized that emotionally something had really happened to me, that I shut down my emotions from my family. So not only was I physically wounded, I was emotionally wounded. To what degree, I didn't know, but I knew that profound things had happened to me physically and emotionally. And as time went on with my healing, the pain was still there. But now I realized that psychologically, I needed to put this event, I needed to understand this whole event, which included understanding what on earth was the United States doing attacking Vietnam in the first place. And so I started reading as much as I could find about American foreign policy, going back mainly to the War of Independence, all the way to the present. And the more I read, the more disgusted I became with my nation, with American foreign policy. And so intellectually, psychologically, I was slowly putting this puzzle of what makes things work together. What are the power structures? And are there power structures behind power structures that I need to find out about? And so those first, well, I continue searching, but especially in the beginning, I needed to know who is responsible for creating this kind of insanity. And I lay most of the blame on my own nation. I won't go into it anymore, but okay, so physically I was wounded, emotionally I was wounded, psychologically I was wounded. In the early 70s, it was 1972, this is 4 years after my injury, I was in Milwaukee. I'd moved from Iowa to Milwaukee, and I was going to art school, which was my wonderful passion. I discovered meditation because I was taking other pain medications. I couldn't have morphine, but I was taking a lot of other pain medication, and I could talk any doctor into giving me pain medication. It wasn't hard at all. But I realized that I was either going to end up addicted, well, I was addicted and didn't even know it, or I was going to commit suicide because of the pain. And then I found meditation, and I was like a duck in water. You know, it was so natural for me to learn to breathe, to calm my whole nervous system, my whole circulatory system, and then let my mind's imagination take me to incredible places where I didn't have any pain. And art was serving the same function, that I would get into art so deeply, and I ended up carving stone for 10 years. And when I was carving the stone, and imagining what I was going to end up with or going towards, I was in no pain. So on kind of a spiritual level, and that's what meditation, where meditation would allow, it would open up windows of my imagination that are just, were quite beautiful. So I discovered that there was this spiritual world that was so unbelievably powerful, much more powerful than the physical world. And so my art and my art expression was allowing me to find out who I was. I wasn't going to let my culture, my militaristic culture, tell me who I am. And art would allow me to discover myself. And each of my stone carvings were symbolic of a certain aspect of myself. And so I would, okay, that's me, that is me. And I would just keep adding to it with every stone sculpture. And after 10 years of carving, then I felt like I was ready to move on. And so I decided to transfer my love and my passion for art and carving stone to teaching children art. So I went back to school, got certified to teach, and taught in the Milwaukee Public Schools for art for 20 years. And in that time, I learned more about love. It was such a great field of occupation to be with children, and to let them know how special they are and how beautiful they are, you know, so I really honed the reality that is inside of me about how to manufacture love. Yeah, so then after teaching, well, here, let me go back. Okay, in 1990, 22 years after I had been wounded, I developed the infection again. It was a bacterial infection. It's one of the smallest bacteria on the planet, and it's really hard to get rid of. And the surgeons told me before I left Bethesda Naval Hospital that in about 20 years, it's most likely going to come back, and you've got to get to the emergency room as soon as you can. So I had to go in for emergency surgery, and rather than go to the VA, which I did not trust at all at that time, I do now, but not then, I went to Rochester, Minnesota, Mayo Clinic to get the tests, and then I had the surgery at St. Mary's there in Rochester. They were supposed to be the best orthopedic surgeons in the world. And so I had another surgery where I ended up, well, they had to take the femur out of my leg, bloody it up, stick it back in my leg, and wrap me with, what do you call it, ACE wrap. And 2 days later, they opened me up again, poured antibiotics all over inside again, and they did that 3 times. And after the second surgery, when I woke up in a world of acid, where I couldn't open my eyes because light was like pouring acid into them. The bed sheets felt like I was laying in acid. Anytime somebody spoke or any noise, it was like acid. All my senses were, oh my God, I was really, really going crazy again. So, they took me in, wait a minute, okay, so at midnight, I buzzed the nurse and told her that I was going insane. And I explained to her all my senses are full of acid. And so about an hour later, a lab coat comes walking in with his 200 questions. And once again, the world had gone totally insane, and I needed much more than a lab coat with 200 questions. But because I couldn't get out of bed, I couldn't find a pencil to stick in my heart, none of that. I just answered his questions, and it took him about 3 hours. And then he left, and then at 5 in the morning, a human being woman came in. She was the head of the psychiatric department, and explained to me that what she believes is going on is that the pain I'm experiencing is I'm back in Vietnam again. It's a flashback, and that my body will not accept morphine, but it's more mental than it is physical. And on some level it made sense. But they couldn't give me any more morphine, because this was 22 years after I couldn't have morphine before. Then when I was in for this second round of surgeries, I could have it again, and then I had this reaction. So the third time they did it, when I woke up from it in my bed by myself, the only thing I had was meditation, and go to my imagination, let it take me where it needs to go. Okay, get ready, because this is a real trip. I'm there in my room by myself. There's a window, and I'm in the bed, laying like this, a wall behind me, there's a wall right over here, and then the room opened up over here. Okay, so I'm doing my breathing. I'm getting into the relaxed state. I know how to self-hypnotize myself. I learned that from a shaman. And so I am doing the breathing. I'm feeling myself going under. And all of a sudden, these images, they're like portraits of very old people. Start, I don't recognize any of them, but they're, going in front of me. And then all of a sudden, the whole room and my whole body starts buzzing with energy. And I open my eyes, and out of the periphery of my vision, there's a Native American floating out of the wall, going along that wall, just real slow. And I'm looking at him, and all in like he's living in the 1700s, buckskin, worn buckskin, beaver claws, necklace, eagle feather. It's really incredible. I mean, as real as you are sitting right there. Moving out along my bed. Another one, he gets about 6 feet out, another one comes out, just as clear as a bell. They're not saying anything. A third one comes out. They're making their way around my bed, floating. The fourth one was a foggy, like is out of focus. And then the fifth thing to come out, they're all going around. Fifth thing to come out was like a glowing sun pulsating, sort of like at sunset when the sun is real red, orange, and it was pulsating. It was about this big around. So these forces are around me. They're not saying a word. I know why they're there. And my knowing is that they are there to help me. They are of the spiritual world. They are here. They came with this energy force that was moving through my room, like it was a big wheel, like it was the size of North America. And this energy was moving through my room real slowly. I know, but this is what that's where my imagination was taking me. So these guys were standing around my bed for about 3 hours, and I was now in this state of love ecstasy. And they disappeared. The energy field stopped buzzing, and early the next morning, the cleaning lady was the first one that came in my room. And I started up a conversation with her. I was so in love in a way that love comes in many different forms. And this form was just pure love. And we had the most wonderful conversation. And then she left, and then some guys with a gurney rolled in the gurney and put me on the gurney. They were going to take me down to physical therapy. And the physical therapy was in the basement, and there were probably 30 people waiting to be seen by therapists. And they set me next to a 9-year-old girl who's sitting in a big motorized wheelchair, sitting up high. She's wearing tie-dye that her uncle made for her, long underwear that he tie-dyed for her to look like an orchid. She was this orchid, but she was dying of cancer. And so they set me next to her, and she and I have the most beautiful conversation. She was full of love too. And which gives me real hope that, the process of dying, we still got battery? The process of dying, we go places we can't imagine. And this was one for her, because she was dying. And yet she and I just had the greatest time. And then the next day they brought me down and sat me next to her again. So for the next week, every day I'd go down and she and I would have these incredible conversations. And so then it was time to leave. They put me in the body cast again and sent me home. And my wife, Beth, and a good friend of ours who had a van, because I was in a body cast, I needed somebody with a van. And so they loaded me in the van, and Beth and my friend Tom, we loved to sing and harmonize. We sang for the next 5 hours driving back to Milwaukee. I was full of love, just full of love. The pain was there, but it was irrelevant to the love. And that amount, that intense love on that level lasted for about 3 months. But then, it started fading, and then I'll call it regular life experience was taken over again. But I had the memory of the power of meditation, and so I've continued using meditation all my life, and I will till I die, to deal with stress, mostly now to deal with stress.
Do you still have pain now?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, now it keeps morphing, because as I'm getting older, I'm getting more sedentary, and so joints, and now both of my legs are saying, we have had enough. That's why I'm using this crutch, because of the pain.
Yeah.
And that, but pain is just a part of my normal. and learning how to deal with pain has been always a real challenge in my life, and I feel like I've dealt with it in magical ways.
Wow. And are you afraid of death?
No. In fact, I think the word death and the word life, they're so small. I think it's, it's just like, it's real similar to a tree growing, the leaves fall, eventually the tree falls, it all becomes part of the earth again, and it just recycles into new life forms and all of that. It's all one infinite experience. To me, that's where I put it.
And when you look back at Vietnam, what are your main feelings about it and the guys you knew who you lost?
I was only there for five and a half weeks. And that's not very long, but it was long enough to change my life in really profound ways. And understand how absolutely insane, it's social insanity on a grand scale. That's where I put it. Just social insanity, and that's what humans do once in a while. And then there are those who won't allow themselves to be involved in it, in the killing, and I'm one of those. That I learned, that was a big lesson for me. That is part of who I am. I cannot harm people, not intentionally anyway.
Well, you've been a tireless advocate for peace and justice ever since, and
Yeah.
we thank you for that. Are there any last words you'd like to leave us with?
Oh, well, everyone goes through this magic carpet ride we call life, with our own experiences. And I'm not here to judge. I'm just, that doesn't do any good at all. It's such an arrogant thing to do. And I have to work at it all the time, not to judge. I really do. I mean, it's every day. But it is a waste of time. The thing we need to be spending our time with is learning how to love each other. Rather than be defensive. And I mean, there's so much power in love that it really protects you. If you let yourself really get into your self-love, it's really a powerful thing. And I mean, my dream would be that everyone comes to that consciousness, but it's like talking to the earth and saying, no more volcanoes, please, no more earthquakes, please. You destroy so much. We are of the earth. We are constantly creating and destroying, just like the earth. So learn to love in the meantime. And I've got a long way to go. I mean, I would love to be in those magical states that I was in with the Native Americans all the time. Wow, what a wonderful thing that would be. But I realize that's just part of the magic carpet ride.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it kept you going.
Yes, it sure has. Without drugs.
Right. Wow.
Yeah.
Well, that's an incredible story, Mark. Thank you for sharing it with us.
Thank you for allowing me to do this.
And you said it's a healing thing for you to reiterate your story.
Every time
Yeah.
anyone's interested and asks me to talk about it, I'm more than willing to talk about it. And I think it's part of my healing process.
Wow.
To
Well,
recognize it rather than shut myself in a room somewhere and
Yeah.
not communicate with anyone, which a whole lot of war veterans do.
Right. Well, it was a privilege to hear it, Mark. Thank you.